even after the urge for up to about a year, they have to basically take care of her, and they have to learn to appreciate who she is for who she is internally and not just externally. So that's the basic idea of the Eshet Yifat Torah. So the whole idea is that it's the Yetzer Hara of the soldiers. The whole idea is the Yetzer Hara of the soldiers. And the question is, he asked a couple of questions. The Zera Shimshon can ask a few questions. He's going to basically start it on. He's going to start it on the on Rashi and then move forward. And we're going to see that it actually the first part is actually going to be applied. It actually applies to not only to Eshet Yifat Torah, but also applies to all of Elul in general. That's my little insight. So it says here, Ki Teitzei milchama amru chazal bil milchemet reshuta katuv medaber. So the Midrash says that when it says Ki Teitzei milchama, it says yeah. So he says like this. So he says that we are talking about a milchemet reshut, meaning that we can only do this. This whole idea of the Eshet Yifat Torah only applies to milchemet reshut. The difference between a milchemet reshut and milchemet mitzvah would be that when Yehoshua was going in with Bnei Israel to claim the land of Israel, so that's milchemet mitzvah. When David and his men decided to expand Eretz Yisrael and expand the gvulot of Eretz Yisrael, that would be a milchemet reshut. Milchemet Eretz Yisrael ketiv behu lo techaya kol neshama. Right. So it says if we look in later on in Dvarim in a few more prakim from now, we see. Last week's parsha, it says that when in milchemet Eretz Yisrael, when we're fighting milchemet chovah, it says lo techaya kol neshama. Rashi says there that we're not allowed to keep no survivors. So the question is like this. So there he says like this: Yesh makshim im kol atzma shel Yifat Torah lo hutra ela keneged Yetzer Hara. Right? He says if all of Eshet Yifat Torah was only to basically acknowledge the fact that we have a Yetzer Hara, and therefore it's permitted only when we have a Yetzer Hara. When we have Yetzer Hara, so he says Lama lo hitira katuv mitam zelf v'mechamet chovah. So he says, why don't we, so there are many people who ask the question, which is a simple question, is if we know that the whole idea of Eshet Yifat Torah is against the idea of Yetzer Hara, so then the whole point is, why not make it also permissible for Milchemet Chovah, right? So he says, so that's the question. Many Mefarshim ask, and they say everyone, he says, every one of them answered their own way. So he says like this, and he says, so he says, according to the Zera Shimshon, he says that just like the Eshet Yifat Torah is permitted during times of ordinary war because of the Yetzer Hara, so to the Isur Shalab Eretz Yisrael, so to the Isur of Eshet Yifat Torah is Asur in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so he says, only these opinions, only these options are basically are appropriate, and these obligatory wars have their prohibition as well. So he'll explain basically what he's saying is that, in a sense, what the Zera Shimshon is saying is that is prohibited during the conquer of Eretz Yisrael. It's also because of the Yetzer Hara, meaning that in both cases it's because of the Yetzer Hara. One case, when we're talking about the war of Milchemet Reshut, then he's saying that we have the Yetzer Hara gets the best of us, and that's why it's permissible. But with the Milchemet Chovah, the godly war, so that because of the Yetzer Hara, we're not allowed to do it. So he's saying it's the same Isur, right? But either way, he's going to explain a beautiful idea in a second. But he's basically saying is that in both cases, there's a logical answer as to why one's permissible and why in one case it's not permissible.
He's going to continue.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just going through this. So he says like this: the very prohibition. What he's saying is that the Zera Shimshon he's saying is that the very prohibition of Eshet Yifat Torah during the conquering of Eretz Yisrael helps a person combat our Yetzer Hara. And he says, and what does he mean by that? He says like this: Shaharei noda sheYehoshua shalach shlosha pruz dugmaot. We look, and he says that Yehoshua, according to the Gemara, Vayikra Rabbi, he says that Yehoshua, when he was entering Eretz Yisrael, he sent all the different nations. He basically sent them letters and said to them, "Listen, do you want to go to fight? We want to do this peacefully, or you want to start fighting."
Give them an offer.
Give them an offer. Exactly. He says, "Whoever wants to make peace with us now, let's just do it nicely, right? You don't have to start, they didn't have to kill everyone. They could have done it, right? In other words, they were giving them the offer. Saying is, listen, we give you the option. Do it nicely, or, we'll step outside and we'll make it, make a big deal, right?
You want to be my friend?
Right. So he says, Pershua mefarshim shekodem hatchalat hamilchama, that before they actually started to conquer the land, lo ayu bichlal lo techaya kol neshama. Before they started conquering their land, the mitzvah of lo techaya kol neshama, which was in last week's parsha, didn't actually apply yet. Meaning the whole point was that last week's parsha we said that a person goes to war for milchemet chova, meaning they have to fight. It says that they have to kill everyone. There's no man or woman or child. There's no one to spare. Okay? So he says before the actual conquering of the land, that mitzvah didn't apply yet. So if we look at the story of Rachav and her family, that was right before. It was right before they actually went in to conquer the land. Right? They sent a few spies in before.
Did he marry her at the end?
Yeah, so that's what he's saying. He's saying is the whole point is right. So he said. So that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying is that why did they allow Rachav to come in? Because Rachav said, I'm going to be smart. If I realize that they're going to do this peacefully, I might as well take advantage of the opportunity,
right.
As opposed to saying what? Saying no, I'm going to fight you. Right? So there's no reason for it. So he says. About otam shelo ishlimu kodem sheyatchil Yehoshua milchama kitiv behu lo techaya kol neshama. He says those people who did not make peace who chose not to make peace with Yehoshua, those people, he says, that's when the lo techaya kol neshama applies. Now, before we get a little further, right? He says is basically if we look at it from this perspective and why does this apply to Elul? We're going to get into it a little bit more in a second, but not about why it applies to Elul, but in general, like the whole concept here. But why does it apply to Elul? Basically, Yehoshua said, listen, I'm giving you a window of opportunity. The sale's good for 3 days. After that, sale's off, right? You decide, right? And how does that apply to us, into Elul? Right, it applies to Elul because Hashem gives us a time to say, Yeshua Hashem b'im matzok, Ratu b'ato karo. Right, during Elul up to Yom Kippur, we have a time. So if we invest the time now, during this window of opportunity, then what we get back is that 10 times better, meaning next year is 10 times better because we've invested the time in Elul. Okay, so now he goes back. There he says. Now, if we look at the whole idea, the whole concept that Yehoshua gave the Amim, the nations, like basically an ultimatum, saying is either you go for peace or you go to battle. Right? He says, why should they accept this? Why should we accept it after the conquest began? I mean, why should we not accept it? Meaning, what's the difference whether they do it? Right? If they fight one fight, let's just say they went to war with one nation, they won, and then the other nation say, you know what? We still want to do peace. Right? In other words, they learned their lesson, so why should it not apply? Why is there a cutoff? Right, why is there a cutoff? Exactly. Why should there be a cutoff? So he says, Shakadosh Baruch Hu Ratzah Lehorot LiYisrael. Hashem wanted to teach Bnei Israel She'otah ha'aretz hatova eina yochal lisbol anashim ra'im v'chataim. This paragraph was so powerful to me when I was reading it. So he says, the reason is that Hashem was trying to teach Bnei Israel that this land, that is Eretz Yisrael, cannot tolerate evil people and sinful people. And the only way for them to fix themselves is to do tshuva before they start impacting other people, and and before that the decree comes to them. Meaning, what does he say? What does the Zera Shimshon? What? Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Before it's too late. In other words, he says you're not behaving the way I want you to believe in Eretz Yisrael. Right. We see that in next week's parsha. We see all the klalot. And we also know that in Vayikra it talks about the point is that anyone who doesn't do well on Eretz Yisrael, doesn't live by the mitzvot of Eretz Yisrael, gets kicked out. Hashem kicks him out. right? And it's, even today you see people who are not necessarily on the highest level. They're the first people to leave. They're the first ones that, they don't want to stay here, right? And they're the ones also talking not so positively about Eretz Yisrael. After the close of that opportunity and that Gizar Din, then whatever the tshuva they do is really not going to help them so much. And they'll be sent out of the land. As I said, as it talks about chtiv vadatem mehira me'al ha'aretz levaraj. We say in Shema vadatem mehira means you'll be basically banished from the land. What happened? Right? What happened to Bnei Israel when they didn't listen to the Nevi'im when they actually moved into Israel? Yeah, the Galut. They got punished. They got severely punished and they got beaten by many nations, right? Etc. Etc. So that's why uvata alehem areh, right? And therefore they got all this different, and they also, like you said, they got galut. So now we can understand why the Eshet Yifat Torah actually helps a person combat why the Eshet Yifat Torah, meaning prohibiting the Eshet Yifat Torah, actually helps a person. Lachen asra Torah alehem yifat Torah b'milchemet Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, we see that the reason why Eshet Yifat Torah is forbidden during the milchamot of the Chovah, right? To show the Bnei Israel that negates the Yetzer Hara, that this ominous sign, maybe what he says is with an ominous sign that negates it. He says to them is that the whole idea is the prohibition of Eshet Yifat Torah when they're doing a mitzvah, they're doing milchemet chovah. The whole idea is that the sign is to teach them a sign about saying is you have an opportunity to do tshuva before you go do something with someone who just right. So he says before you're about to do something not appropriate with this woman.
Okay, not saying to her.
No, he's saying you're about to do something. He's telling to the soldier. He's saying you're about to in a milchemet reshut. He says things are a little different. But when you're setting the tone for Eretz Yisrael. The soldiers going in there, you can't say, we have a purpose, we have a higher purpose, and we have a higher purpose. We can't really say, we're going to give into our Yetzer Hara. Hashem is saying is no. He's saying is the reason why I'm forbidding it. The reason why I'm forbidding the Eshet Yifat Torah when I'm doing milchemet chovah, milchemet mitzvah, is so that you stay focused, so you understand that there is this point that you're not supposed to give into your Yetzer Hara. It's a sign. Right now, to remind you that it's permissible on a very mamash b'diavad level. I don't want you to do this like every time. I want you to stay focused.
There's also another issue,
which is
not mentioned here at Zera Shimshon, is that Milchemet Mitzvah is with the Shivat HaAmamim of Eretz Yisrael.
Right.
As opposed to Milchemet Reshut, which
is with everyone. Right.
With distant nations.
Right.
So when you're doing a Milchemet Mitzvah with the Shivat HaAmamim in Eretz Yisrael, the whole idea is to distance yourself from them. Is to basically move them away.
Right.
Hashash of Avodah Zarah.
Right.
So by getting someone, allowing Eshet Yifat Torah,
right,
you're contradicting their needs. Suddenly, she's an Eshet Yifat Torah from an Am of Eretz Yisrael.
Exactly. Very good.
That's defining that purpose.
Very good.
Neighboring countries would be more forbidden.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the whole issue is that they're here. We're going to live here, and they're going to be here, and we're going to be influenced. We're not going to be influenced by them.
Even people who are not so good, even the people who are evildoers, also plan at some point to do tshuva.
Yoshua ben Sarah, that's the name.
Oh, Yoshua ben Sarah. Okay, so Zrat Hashem, the Refuah Shema for our good friend Yoshua ben Sarah, who just went under surgery a couple of days ago. Yesterday. I think it went well. Zrat Hashem. Anyways, they always say that what happens? What happens when the people who are not following the path so well? What do they say? They always say, "We got time. Don't worry about it. We'll do it later." Or, "Well, what's the big deal? She's here right now. I'll take care of it. We'll worry about tshuva later." No,
talking about in the war?
In a holy war, right? He's saying it's like, so he says, "Yodim shedamrinan, Yodim Rishem shedakam l'mitah." They know, right? They know that even the people who are not so good and don't follow the path so much, they know what the end is. What's the end? The end is that unfortunately everyone dies, right? So if everyone dies, so what is it? They say, "Oh, we got time. Don't worry about it," right? They got time. So then if they've got time, they say, "We don't worry about it. We'll worry about the tshuva later." In other words, let me do my thing right now.
But isn't that
What?
Aren't you forbidden to ask for tshuva? If somebody's like going like hey, I'm gonna do this
Stop
stuff,
that
and I'm gonna
shit.
ask, like beforehand, I'm gonna do this, and then I'll do tshuva.
Yeah, that's why they're not necessarily considered the greatest people, because they're saying is.
And is that tshuva actually accepted?
That's a different story. I'm not here to say what it is. It is, but Ela sheyesh lahem d'chilav al kisem. And is that they say is that they're being blinded by the logic. Why? Because they're saying is, I see this woman right here. The Yetzer Hara is right in front of me. Let me deal with this Yetzer Hara. I'll take care of it now, and I'll do tshuva later. Like you said, echtav v'ashuv. It's not probably the best thing to do. This is what the Yetzer Hara wants you to do, and it gives us. Right? And that's what the Eshet Yifat Torah is coming to negate, so that the Jewish people would rid themselves of sin before they entered Eretz Yisrael. That's why the Milchemet Chovah, it's Asur, meaning we're not, because the whole point of Milchemet Chovah, meaning a holy war, right? A war to go in to Eretz Yisrael, to conquer the land, and to actually earn and live in the land of Eretz Yisrael. That land, the reason why it's prohibited is because it's Eretz Yisrael.
We have to be worthy of it.
We have to be worthy of Eretz Yisrael. We can't be worthy of Eretz Yisrael where Hashem says, if you don't follow my Torah, I'm going to kick you out. That's what Hashem says to Bnei Yisrael about Eretz Yisrael. So he says, I'm permitting the Yetzer Hara to go, when you're talking about Mechemet Reshut, when it's we'll call it a non-obligatory war, meaning like a optional war, if you will. In that case, Hashem says, okay, with an optional war, I'll be a little bit more flexible, right? Because there, it's okay, I understand, and that also most of the time it happens. You'll see that he gets into another point here, but basically it happens is that in those situations, a little bit more understandable. But when we're trying to set the precedent of Eretz Yisrael and what Eretz Yisrael is meant to Hashem, there Hashem says the exact same reason why it's permissible for Melchemet Reshut is the same reason why it's Asur for Melchemet Chovah. Now he goes another approach, and he says like this. He goes to another Odesh Lamar. He goes to two other options as to why Eshet Yifat Torah is Asur in Melchemet Chovah, meaning the let's call it the compulsory wars, and why. So he says like this. He says that the question of the commentators is in meaning that their whole approach of the entire concept that people ask is in of itself is problematic. The Rambam writes in Perik Chet of Hilchot Melachim, Ein Eshet Yifat Torah muteret ela b'shat hashivya. Right, and Eshet Yifat Torah is only permitted when she's taking time of capture. Right, meaning b'shat hashivya hainu lachar milchama, dahainu lachar arigatam ayuvim. He says that according to the Rambam says that Eshet Yifat Torah is only in the time of the capture, only in the time of the capture itself. And when does the capture take place? When does the capture take place?
But you can only
after. You can only actually do something with her after the war. Right.
No, you can do at least once during the war.
No.
Yes, you can marry her during the war, but
But you can be with her.
Right. So he says b'sha'at hashivya, at the time of capture. U'sha'at hashivya hainu lachar. And at the time of capture, he says, according to Zera Shimshon, the time of capture is only after the war. Dahainu lachar igat ha'uyuvim. He says only after killing the enemies, because when you're fighting the enemies, you can't do anything with her, right? You can't do anything yet. You can only do something with her after the enemy has been killed. That's what he says.
That makes so much more sense in the Holy War where it's...
Right. V'chenu omer, v'hikita et kol zechura leficharav, right? You should kill all the males. V'achar kach hanashim v'ataf re'bima tavozlo. Then it says afterwards, in last week's Parsha, it says kill all the males, and then only afterwards, right? Then you can have the women and the children and the animals and whatever. Then you can have it. Meaning he's saying is that you can't take the woman when the men are still alive. Right? Well, you can't take a woman and say, oh, she's mine if her husband's still right. Exactly. Well,
Again, doesn't it still say that you can be with her at one time?
Yes, you can, but that.
No,
I don't think so. I don't think it's ifishish. I don't think so.
And in this case, you had to kill the men as well. I thought this was only in a case where the men didn't have to be killed.
Milchemet Reshut.
If it was like but Milchemet Reshut, meaning you're allowed to take Some things you have to just completely destroy and obliterate everything. You don't get to keep anything.
Right.
That's
And the chovah
That's Milchemet Chovah.
in
Right.
Israel.
in Israel.
In Israel, right.
Against the 7 nations.
And in Milchemet Chovah, can you take the women?
No.
No.
Okay. When can you take the women?
When it's Milchemet Reshut, when you're trying to expand the borders of Eretz Yisrael beyond that which Hashem, like what David HaMelech was doing when he was fighting.
So in Milchemet Reshut, you have to kill the men?
Yes, that's what he's saying. He's saying that last week's
And
Parsha,
then the women and the livestock and all that.
Are
You're
become
allowed
yours.
to keep.
You're allowed
The
to
men
keep.
have to go.
right? And that's why the Psukim last week's Parsha, the Psukim read, kill the men first, and then the women are available to you, and the children and the cattle, or whatever. Good question. And then he says, in this week's Parsha, he says that's why. I mean, he doesn't say it here, but that makes sense now as to why the last week's Parsha ends on Milchemet Reshut, and then this week's Parsha it continues with Milchemet Reshut. Why? Because in order to explain to us that the Eshet Yifator only makes sense when you have men have been killed first, and then the women can then become your Eshet Yifator. But even so, you have a whole list of halachot of Eshet Yifator because you have to be. It's a very unique condition and situation. And then he says, Yesh at according to this, there can be a Eshet Yifator during the wars with other nations, the Sharomot, meaning not the 7 nations, like you mentioned. Yesh at what?
7 nation army.
Right, 7 nations, right. So he says, Yesh at there is a time right? There is a time when you can capture the women. That's only after the men have been killed. When we're fighting against the 7 nations that are there, the 7 nations that are there for us to conquer Eretz Yisrael, right? We have no time to capture. The only thing that we can capture is actually their money. Meaning we can kill. We have a mitzvah to kill people from the Sheva Amim. We can keep their money, but we can't keep all their stuff, their possessions. Besides their money, we have to actually give up. But their money we can keep.
Gold, yes.
Right.
Livestock, no.
Correct. Right, so he says here, Adarav, only their money, and there was no capturing of women. So he says, if you think about it, when there's actually a moment of captivity, then you can have this Eshet Yifator. But when we're talking about the 7 nations, there's no moment of captivity. We have an obligation to kill everyone. Right, that's the obligation. So if we have an obligation,
there's never going to be a situation.
Exactly, and right, that's what he's saying. He's technically there's never a moment of shivya. So that's the point. Is he's saying for Eretz Yisrael, of course it makes sense not to have one because there is no moment where you can actually it would apply. When you're talking about expanding the borders of Eretz Yisrael into Milchemet Reshut, then there's a moment when you kill the men and the women and children are still alive. And the livestock is still yours. Then you could say, okay, great. Now the situation of Eshet Yifator applies. Now he says, V'od b'milchemet Eretz Yisrael, when we're conquering Eretz Yisrael, he says, Hi chova al kol Yisrael al kulam ve'ino bi'ado lachiotai. So he simply was unable to keep her alive. Shareach cherim yahargua. Right? Other people are going to. Basically, he's saying is there's not going to be a woman spared during the time of conquering Eretz Yisrael. There's not going to be a moment where you say, okay, women, let's give a pause. We'll have a nice peaceful pause for a few days. No, the point is that if I don't kill her because I think she's attractive, the next guy's going to come and say, I have a mitzvah to kill everyone, so I'm just going to go out and kill her. There's no moment of where one guy says yes and this other guy says no. It's open to everyone, meaning to kill them all. Not the case. Right? He says is one in a Milchemet Reshut, one person could say, I want to keep her as a woman. And he says, okay, that's yours. And then we could, you could either fight it out with the other guy, or you could say, fine, she's yours. But in the case of Milchemet Chovah, we don't have that situation because if I say I want to keep her, the next guy says, you don't have an opportunity to keep her. She has to be killed. So there's no one to be alive. So there's not an option for Eshet Yifator. So that's why we say Eshet Yifator only applies to Milchemet Reshut because in every other situation it doesn't apply. There are no captives. There's no captives. They're all dead. Exactly. So that's what
That's how we know that this only
applies for Milchemet Reshut.
I actually know that. I thought it was allowed.
No.
For the 7 nations inside of Israel.
No, the opposite. What he's saying is that the whole point of the reason why the Yetzer Hara allows us to have it, he said before you came, he said the reason why we're allowed to have it why the Yetzer Hara is permitted outside of Eretz Yisrael is because the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael is so strong, and Hashem doesn't want to even allow us to get into the mindset that Yetzer Hara is permissible. What do we know about Hashem saying when we do things wrong in Eretz Yisrael? He kicks us out. He kicks Golos. It's automatic Golos. Right? We see that when Bnei Yisrael do go into Eretz Yisrael, what happens? They do the bad things. They don't follow the Nevi'im chastise them. What happens? They get kicked out.
But we're permitted
to do it when we're
for the Yetzer, because the Yetzer Hara is going to drive us out. But the Yetzer Hara maybe isn't as strong.
Out when we're trying to expand Eretz Yisrael, but in the biblical borders of Eretz
Yetzer Hara is tamed.
It's tamed, and Hashem says
and the consequences are greater.
Correct, and Hashem says that should be your sign. It's like two sides of the same coin. On one side, I'm telling you, it's permissible. Obviously, it's not the ideal scenario, but it's permissible when you're trying to just expand the world's, the borders of Eretz Yisrael. But when you're in Eretz Yisrael, the flip side is, no way. Don't do it, because Eretz Yisrael is so much higher than your urge for your Yetzer Hara, which is acting up right now. That's that's the first term.
Higher tolerance in the Yetzer Hara department when you're doing the Chama Chovah, like where God just gives you a lot more thought.
What's that? I'm sorry.
God will give the army.
No, what was the question? What was the first part of
There
it?
has to be a lot more assistance in conquering the Yetzer Hara, as well as the enemies.
Yeah.
When it's a Chovah,
Oh, absolutely. Hashem, right. But the point, you have to remember who's fighting this war. Remember, last week's Parsha, what did Hashem, what do the Chayalim go out? Anyone who's married recently, opened a home, a house, a vineyard, whatever it is, you're talking about people who are on a very high madrega in and of itself. Like even the person who is, let's say he's cleared all those bases, he's cleared all those. Right? He has to be a person who's not even going to think about, he says, and the person who's nervous, he's also not allowed to go. Why? He says, Shema my chet, one of my chataim might cause me to be meharher, and therefore I won't be focused on the war. So we're talking about people who are on like a super high madrega here. We're not talking about, so even so, the person who's on a high madrega, and he says, my Yetzer Hara is going to get the best of me, that's a really, obviously Hashem is realizing, or the Torah is realizing that the Yetzer Hara is clearly strong. And during time of war, we know things go, there's a lot of, no logic happens in war. There's nothing happens, it's logic there. Right? So it's clear about that. So Hashem says, even these people who are in such a high madriga, and we've already filtered out all the people that might possibly be, challenging with the situation, even so, I recognize that there's an urge. Do I recognize the urge and say, okay, we should do it for both Milchemet Chovah and Reshut? Absolutely not. When we're talking about Reshut, there's a different kind of war. Hashem, with the Milchemet Chovah, Hashem says, this is the land I promised you. And because I promised you, I want you to fight it with the right focus. You want to expand the Gvulot of Eretz Yisrael? That's a different story. Then I could start, we could be a little, I'm not saying being flexible, but I can understand that there's a little bit more chaos, if you will. Right?
It's an interesting point, is that the question that Zera Shimshon asked in this is not why is Eshet Ish Muteret in Milchemet Reshut, is why it's not allowed in Milchemet Chovah, which is kind of counterintuitive to us in modern times. To us it's like Asur, זה אסור, תתגבר על היצר, and meaning my personal question is, why is it even allowed in Milchemet Reshut? Right? I mean, we come from a different perspective.
So he's asking this, what his answer is, he's saying is that because in Milchemet Chovah it's not allowed. Why is it not allowed in Milchemet Chovah? Because they have to kill everyone. In Milchemet Reshut, the women are still alive. So that's when it becomes permissible.
Right.
You're asking.
Even then, it's like, okay, you still got Milchemet Yetzer, just like there's other Isurei.
Right. There's other Yetzer things going
around, and the bigger question is like, what Lama Dafka Po?
Right. That's a good question. That I don't know the answer to. I mean, I would imagine that it has something to do with the fact that people recognize that when war, there's a lot of chaos, and people, there are women and screaming and children, what's going on, who knows what's going on, and all of a sudden you have to say as well, the person who would thought he was on such a high level, the real test comes when, as they say, there are no atheists in the foxhole, right? Like when a person's in the middle of the bunker, right? He's not going to be like, oh, I'm an atheist. No, he's going to dive in as hard as he can, right? So when he's in a situation when it's when push comes to shove, and he sees this woman, and he sees, the things, no one's around besides him and whatever. So then but that same thing is the same point. Is just like he's allowed to take her, he also has there's a whole series of things that he has to do first to make sure that he actually that he's mitkaber on his yetzer, meaning
not impulsive.
Right. It's not just take her right now. Right. I have to do a whole thing and make sure. And then I was listening to a shir about this actual Torah, and it said, we want to make sure that the person who marries her that he's marrying her not only for the chitzoniyut, but actually for the enoshut, meaning for the personality that she has.
Right.
So it's not just the.
So we make her do what?
We make her grow out her head, shave her head, and grow out
We make her cut her
nails.
We make her cut her nails or grow her nails.
Right.
Rags, dirty clothes.
We make her why? Because she was wearing really attractive.
Exactly.
We try to entice you.
Right.
And we make her sit there. You gotta look. You know that like tension when you come home and just like you feel like you're like it's toxicity. Oh, I gotta hide. You know, so like you gotta be looking at her Yom V'Layla.
And
30 days and she's wailing.
And
I don't
the-
need to
and the
hear
wife
this.
in the house
I've been
is
working.
eating
I just came out of war. I worked a hard day, and you're coming home
And you're crying?
crying like this. Like you think I need this?
Right. So if
So then after 30 days, you're still all in, and you need to marry her.
right,
And you need to know that at the end of the day, if you're like, this doesn't work out, like the Torah's basically.
you're not allowed to keep her.
You can't, hey, you know what, I'm going to switch it to slave.
You're not
I'll
allowed.
sell her,
No, you're.
get some cash out of this.
I had a good joke. Someone was saying you should take. No, you should bring some flowers for your wife. You had these roses at the door. I was just leaving the office, so I said I'll give her some flowers. She can bake some challahs with them.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. So that was.
Comments, we're going to block you.
So now we're gonna do. Your wife is watching.
My
Anyway.
wife is actually listening.
Anyway, so that was Jerush Aleph. Now we're going to go to Jerush Zayin. Jerush Zayin is later on in this week's Parsha. We learn about the fact that. Oh yeah, I have to okay, pause it.
No, I was you can do that.
Okay, sure. This is
His name, and his wife was as sweet as could be, and he's a big Baal Tzedakah, and he's a big lover of Israel, and he mamish knows Torah. He knows a lot of Torah for your, like, you know, on your way to being converted. He just knew a lot of Torah. So apparently, I mentioned to him, you know, in the car, because we were talking about, I learned this sefer called Zera Shimshon or whatever. I didn't think much of it. Anyway, I hadn't spoken to him since then. 2 hours after I ordered the set for this guy Jimmy, who brought me down, I go, he sends me a text, this guy Greg, he goes, hey, I know we haven't spoken since December. I remember our conversation in the car about Zera Shimshon. I want to let you know I just ordered a set. What? So I was so moved.
The timing of it. You just ordered one.
I just ordered. So I took the email. I said, listen to me. And I sent it to him. And I said, look, I know this is crazy. You know, I know, so you don't know who Jimmy is. But I'm on this trip. I want to thank a guy. I got him this set. You see the time, date, stamp. 2 hours ago. I've never gotten a set before in my life. All right. I don't know necessarily what it means, but I'm letting you know, like, this is what happened. And they say this type of stuff goes on
with the Zera Shimshon.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Interesting. So he wrote back. He's like, look, I don't know this Jimmy either. But maybe we should all have a learning group.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
On Zoom or something.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
so the next Torah is about. It's a great story. These Zera Shimshon stories are weird. They're wild. They happen all the time. They happen. It's remarkable. Actually, at the Hilula, he said there are two kinds of people in this room right now. There are kind of people who had some sort of thing happen to them because of their learning, or people who are learning because they made it tonight that they're hoping that something will happen. Right. But those are the two kinds of people. And usually they start learning Zera Shimshon because they've heard of the Segula and they're waiting for it to kind of happen.
I found an apartment in a frat next to Shirat David. That's a miracle.
Really?
That's a miracle.
What?
Yeah,
That's a miracle.
That's a miracle. Hanukkah.
It's a miracle. That really
End
is.
of Hanukkah. It's really hard to find. We went everywhere.
See that? Let's put the Zera Shimshon.
Zera Shimshon.
Anyway, so we're going to continue now, and we're going to do Jerush Zayin. So one of the famous psukim, or maybe famous sections of this week's Parsha, they're all famous, but one of them is that we're not allowed to, or we have a mitzvah to actually not marry a Moavi and Amuni. And there's a famous Gemara, we're going to get to the Gemara later on, the Gemara in Yevamot, right, Amuni, where we're not allowed to, the men are not allowed to convert, but the women, we're allowed to allow them into our nation, and obviously because we're allowed to, because of Moaviyah, Ruta Moaviyah. So obviously there was a permission. So that exactly that question as to why Ammon and Moab are so hated, meaning they're so, the mitzvah is basically we're not allowed to bring them in even 10 generations later. That's a strong one. right? So he's
Only
going to.
the Egyptians.
Right, that's what he's going to get to as well. He's going to say, he says, Mela, the Egyptians, I would say that the opposite. I would say the Egyptians would be more of a hate
Like
than
they
everyone.
inflicted more
Right,
pain.
exactly. So he's asked the question like that.
Actually talking about Karat Tov to the Egyptians.
Right, so that's what he doesn't mention that here, but it's he does mention it sort of. So here we go. So he says, Al Dvar Asher Lo Kidmu Etchem Alechem. So he says, the pasuk reads that the reason why we're not allowed to, or that we're meant to, or we're not allowed to marry a Moni or a Moavi, is because these nations do not provide us with food. As the pasuk says, Al Davar Asher Lo Kidmu Etchem Alechem. Pirish Rashi. Rashi says, Al Ha'itza She'atzu Etchem Lachtiechem. Rashi says it's not. The pasuk says it's because they didn't give you food, right? But who just right? And so he says, but Rashi says it's because they plotted against you to sin. So the Zera Shimshon says he doesn't. First, he quotes the Mizrahi, and the Maharal Miprag, the Gur Aryeh, and he says the pasuk yesh tamacher for right? It's obvious, and the pasuk says, here's the reason they didn't give you food and water. So why is Rashi sticking out his nose?
Back to that again. Besides, didn't we punish them already?
Right, exactly. So he says, like, why is Rashi all of a sudden getting involved?
Didn't they also give you food, but they gave you like salty?
That's later. He's going to talk about that in a second. That's towards the end. He mentions the fact that they gave us food,
And
but
which
it
was even worse.
right.
Thirsty.
right. Tertzu, he says, he says, why would Rashi even come up with, why do you think it's okay to add another reason? The pasuk clearly states, they didn't give you food, so there's your answer. So he says, Tertzu di Rashi diek milat davar. If you look at the pasuk, it says the word davar. Davar is not usually the word that we would say. Why, when we say, why are we not allowed to do something? Because blah, 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 blah. Ki, or kasher, or biglal, or whatever word, mipnei, or something like that. We would never use the word al davar, right? That's not the way, even the Torah doesn't talk like that. We usually say ki, right? So he says, the reason the word davar means that there's some sort of conversation or some sort of, like their plot, they came up with a plot. And he says, Tertzu darashi diek milat davar, shayalo lamar al asher. Right, it should have said al asher. The pasuk should have said al asher, and because the pasuk didn't say al asher or ki or something like that, and it would use the word davar, so these two, that is the Maharal Miprag, which is the Gur Aryeh, and the Mizrahi, which is another Mefaresh, both said is that the word davar means that some sort of plot, they were contriving something. Now, he says, he says, even after explaining this, we still have a question. Even let's say we accept the fact that Rashi, what they said is right. He said we have a question. Shaharei Rashi atzmo katav kan b'samuch. When he says Rashi later on, when we're talking about Rashi himself writes later on that tam shenitavu amonu moav hu mipnei shechtiu et Yisrael. The reason why we are so we are obligated to hate or kind of really not allow them into our nation is because they caused the Jewish people to sin. He says that one person who causes to sin is worse than the one who kills him. So he says, it says that the reason to hate Ammon and Moab is because of their attempt to cause us to sin. If that's the case, then why didn't they? When Nakatam Sheino Ikar Dahainu Al Davar Shelo Kimu, he says, I have a good question. He says, okay, let's just say that the actual reason is that it's because they cause us to sin. And if they cause us to sin is such a bad problem, then why didn't the pasuk say?
Meaning they used a very
right.
reason.
Either the pasuk is right, and therefore it's not the main reason is that they didn't give us food, or Rashi's right, and because it caused us to sin. But one of them is wrong. Right? You can't say that the pasuk is wrong because you wouldn't be able to say it. But the pasuk should have said.
Right.
The pasuk should have said what? It should have said because they caused us to sin.
Yeah.
The fact that the pasuk didn't do it, and Rashi does say that they caused us to sin, is something's not right here. That's the Gemara. It's a good question actually. The question of the Zera Shimshon. So now he says, "V'yesh lomar de'i hava kativ hatam shal machtia ta'adam lo haya efshar lomar amoni v'lo amonit." Right, so now he says a great point. He says, what would be if I said the reason why you're not allowed to marry a Moavi or Ammoni is because it caused us to sin? Then what would be our default response? well, if they cause us to sin, then everyone is off the tar.
And maybe even the women.
Even the women, right? And you would say even the women are forbidden. There's no way you could say that the women are permitted if they cause us to sin, right?
That's a funny question to ask.
Oh, I said why?
Because instead of saying, why is the Moabit allowed? You're saying, oh, because the Moabit is allowed, therefore that can't be the Tibbutz. Meaning...
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, why do we have to say that the real reason is because of the chet, but we can't say it beferush, and it's rather because they didn't give you money, because the women are allowed.
He's going to get to another reason later on as well. There's another reason, but this is a good
Okay,
question.
but at face value.
Yeah. Your face value, you're right. It's a good point. So he says here, we know the main reason was because of the women. The whole problem with Chet Moab was the women. Right? Okay, so he says, Ela katavatam al davar asher kidmu, shegam sham yesh lakshot. For there too we can ask that maybe why was the permission not apply equally to women? So he says, Hayal lehem lekadem anashim likrat anashim. For men should have come towards the Jewish men with food. V'nashim likrat nashim, and the men and the women should come with women. Right? What happens when you give food to at those times? Right? We have the men should have gone to the men, and the women should have gone to the women from Mishum Tzniut. Right? We have to answer. I don't know why we have to answer it, but he says that the women were probably in, but we have to answer it. I'm not disrespecting Zera Shimshon, God forbid. I'm just saying, to me, it's just like, right? So let's just say that he says, it means that the woman it's not appropriate for the woman to go out.
Well, I do understand why he's saying it.
Why?
Because that's his way of exempting
Okay, right,
from
okay,
the
fine,
chet
good.
Shelo Kidmu.
Okay, you're saying
He's saying because
the men went out first, and the women were inside their tent.
So
Right.
they were not involved in the chet melachatchila because it's not
Okay,
nahug
good.
for her to, for the
Good.
women to
Okay. Right, they weren't expected to come. Good for you. Okay, good. Mimela anu lomdim shema sheyatzu lamilachti et Yisrael ein lahem shum onesh. So he says here, the fact that we learn from this is that the fact that the women didn't come out originally, and even if we say that their husbands or their fathers forced them to go, their sin, he's going to say that in a second, is that the fathers, for the younger women, the fathers forced them to go out. So if you say that women were forced to go out, you could say that they were probably not necessarily as excited to do the sin as originally what we thought. Right, exactly. So he says they were like chorus, exactly, anusotin. Okay? So he says like this. Lefi Aimet, now the verse is worded in a certain way that explains this whole Perush. Perush pasuk kachu. Lefi Aimet, ikar atam shenitavu Ammon u'Moab al chet shechtium. Right? The truth is, the main reason why Ammon and Moab are so loathed, right, is because the sin that they caused the Jewish men to engage in, which we know is the chet Moab, right? Avalo al amasa chet mamash el ha'itza v'ha'ichrach. Right? It's rather for the plot that they had. Meaning, the fact that they sinned is one thing, but the whole idea is what was the plot behind Ammon and Moab? The whole plot was, how do we cause Bnei Israel to sin? Right? And that plot is even worse, in some ways, he says, is worse than the sin itself. Because their plot shows what their really intentions are. What's their intention? To cause Bnei Israel. Oh, we're about to get there. Yeah, very good. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. Very good. Very good. We mentioned that before. This guy you're holding, man. Very good. Yeah. So he says like this. He says, but rather the plot itself. Like I said, the reason why it says al devar, meaning the whole plot, is that the whole point is that the father or the male forced the women to do what the plot that they had in their head. You had this whole plot in your head, and instead of saying, okay, it's just in my head, they started taking action. And instead of doing it themselves, they caused their daughters to do it. So he's saying this whole plot, that's the reason why it says al devar. The pasuk it says al devar, the plot itself, and therefore the plot is worse. That's why the pasuk uses the word al devar, and why it says that's the main sin. The main sin is not necessarily that it's al devar, is that it's the devar is the plot that they had, plus the fact that they didn't give you food and water. Meaning the devar, the whole idea is the storyline of the devar is the plot, meaning al devar, the plot that they had to cause us to sin. Asher lo kidmu etchem, right? And then also, and he doesn't use the word vav. You need a vav, but he doesn't have it there, right? But it's saying that the Jewish people, which entailed compelling them, right? He says, since the men created this whole plot, therefore it applies to the men. That's why he says, va'afilu hachi, im haya lehem zechut liot maktimim b'lechem v'mayim. Let's say Ammon and Moab had the merit of going to they had the merit to go out and give food and water to Bnei Israel. Hayunit kanim kitzat, their sin would have been somewhat, let's say they would have said, you know what, we see Bnei Israel coming, and you say, you know what, we feel bad for what we did a couple of years ago, we're going to be large, we'll be the big person, what we're going to do? We're going to go out and give them water and food, right? The first time when Bnei Israel leave Mitzrayim, right? So they go out, they see Moab and Ammon see them, and they say, you know what, let's try to do a sulcha, as they say in Hebrew, right? Let's try to do a little something. Well, we caused you to sin before, let's give you some food and water, and we'll try to make things better. So maybe, he says, maybe their sin would have been a little bit, brought down a little bit, meaning the people wouldn't have looked at it as great. So he says, Mishum the Perak Yud Aleph, the Sanhedrin, as you said, and we see in Sanhedrin, we say that when a person is hungry or a person is thirsty, the first thing you do, even a person that you don't care for so much, he sees you're hungry and thirsty, right? You give him a little bit of food and water, all of a sudden the guy's like, oh, I'm not so, I can respect this guy a little bit because he got me in the time of need, right? So we could have, that little bit of water and food that the Moavim and Ammonim could have given us,
gesture.
would have been a nice gesture, exactly. Good?
Let me ask you a question though.
Yes.
It's not Zera Shimshon question.
Yeah.
It's just the Pshat. When they say Hashem lo kidmurtchem belechem, right, in mind, strictly speaking, we asked, didn't we?
Yes.
Meaning, to say lo kidmu
Means that they did the first, they take
should have come out of their own accord and said,
Well,
we're
that's-
coming out.
right.
But really, it's even worse than that because we asked and they said no.
Right.
Which I think is worse than...
So he's going to get exactly right. So that's exactly right. So he's saying, Asher lo kidmu, right? Al davar asher lo kidmu. First they had a plot, and asher lo kidmu means that they didn't take the initiative and say, you know what, we caused them to sin way back
What
when.
they do is throw them some.
All right, give them a little bit of water.
Even when we asked,
Right, they said no.
they said no.
Yeah.
Right, and that's what he's going to get to in a second. So he says, Aval achshav shelo kidmu, but now that they did not greet the Jewish people, like you just said, because they didn't even greet the Jewish people with food and water, what do we learn about that? Nitabu, they became even worse. What do we learn about that? We learned that their intentions this entire time were not the right intentions, meaning that they never even were considering of Ammon and Moab were from the Milachatchila, they were thinking always to plot against the Jews. Meaning they were always thinking of some way to cause us to sin, whether it's to cause us to sin actually with the women, or they were saying is, we don't want to give the Jews anything, so we're not going to give them anything, and what are we going to do?
Meaning it was genocidal in nature.
Yeah, exactly. That's a strong word, but yeah, but right.
Yeah, that was
Yeah.
That was the idea.
Okay, so
Now,
now,
by the way, but like
Yeah.
in their defense, we did just kill a lot of their people. I
right,
mean, they're probably still sitting Shiva.
right,
And you're like, by the way, in the Shiva house, can you give me some water?
right.
Right.
Okay, I hear that. I don't know if it was so. I don't know if it was so close, but you're right. Right. You're saying it's still fresh in their minds.
I would think so.
I think so. Yeah, good point. Good. Okay. Now he says. Now he's going to say something that you v'im tomar. He says something beautiful, and then he goes into Balak and Bilam in a second. Im tomar harei Moab shel v'sof arbim shana kadam lehem belechem v'mayim. Let's just say, like you mentioned before. Or you said that they did give them food at the end of the day, right? They did give them food.
Right.
Okay, salty or not, they gave them food, right? Right? He says that you should sell food for money, and I'll eat, right? That's what we say later on, earlier on, right? And so still the Moavim, we are told that Ammon and Moab do give us food, and they say, we'll pay for it. We do say, we'll pay for it, right?
Yeah.
So if that's the case, right, and yet, even though we say we're going to pay for it, it's a good business deal, everyone's happy.
What are you giving them a hard time?
Right, exactly. Right, exactly. So he says, what's the point? We look at the Maharsha in Sanhedrin, it says, they should have done it for free. That's what he says. Hold on. Hold on. L'tashlum gomol masha sa Avraham Avinu lo. He says is the fact that Avram Avinu saved Lot, and from Lot came Ammon and Moab. That alone should have been there. Now, what in my last class when I gave this, people said is, do you think the people who are alive today think about their great, how many greats back? Grandfather says, "Oh yeah, that guy was spared, so I'm going to spare you." Right? I mean, that's a big ask. It's a tough ask. You're saying like some guy 10 generations, maybe 12 generations later, is going to say, I'm going to do a nice favor for you because our mutual great whatever.
Yeah.
Excuse me, we see stories, this is off
Oh,
topic.
yeah, like the Holocaust.
Not only that, we're
Right.
talking about, there's a lot of Arabs
Right.
who live in villages over here
Yeah,
who have a history of coming from Jewish descent.
really.
And unfortunately, they're our worst enemies.
Right.
Traditions at the Kfar
Oh, yeah.
Kevon is known to have Chamulot
Really,
who were of Jewish descent.
really.
The most dangerous cities. Funny.
Anyway, so he says like this. So he says they should have been respecting the fact that Avraham Avinu saved their father Lot. Vayalem lasot ze baderech sheyatzu Mitzrayim. They should have done it. When should they have done it? When they were leaving Mitzrayim. They should have done it now, not now when we're like on the brink of going into Eretz Yisrael. They should have done it right when we were getting close, when we were leaving. V'ita barashi v'midrash, and we say that's why it says baderech on the term meaning b'shat terufchem. At the time when you were disoriented, that's when it should have done it. It says that if you look at the pasuk, right? If the pasuk later on, the pasuk says the reason that the term on baderech means that when you were disoriented, that saying is that Ammon and Moab should have provided us food when we were just coming out of Mitzrayim, when we were already disoriented.
That's an even bigger ask. Because
Exactly.
we weren't even there.
Right. So he says even when the Jewish people were in distress, these people did not come to help them. Now he says like this. Right, so now and he's going to ask even a better question in a second, which is I think it's a great question. Anyway, so he says that either which way we end up, it's too late. It was too late for them to try to save themselves from punishment. Their whole time they've been doing, right? They're basically doing things to hurt themselves. Now he says, "V'im tomar shemash lo asu b'chinam ein lam kol kach hashma." Let's just say we say, you know what? The fact that they did it for money, they were right. Think about it. He says, look what he says. Right? You have 1.2, let's just at minimum 600,000 people, right? Men, plus women, plus children. We're talking about 1 million people, let's just say.
Very wealthy nation, though.
Yeah, but even so he says, but the point is that that's what he's going to get to. What he's saying is, you're asking a nation to feed another nation, and you're going to do it for free. Right? That's a good business question, right? Good question. So he says, he says, like you said, their money was very precious to them. He says their money was very precious to them. And that's why when the first time around...
They're ready to give it all away to Balak.
Right, that's exactly a good point. He literally was about to say that.
Oh my
Right?
God, look at
Look
this.
at this guy, right? He's literally about to say that. Anyway, so he says
This dude is on fire.
So he says exactly that. He says, now, he says exactly that, right? Exactly. He says, I don't understand. If they're being stingy here, right, they want to make a business deal here,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden they're like, or we want to make money here, but all of a sudden we're like, oh yeah, we'll give all the money to Balak and Bilam. So you can't have it both ways, right? Either you want to make the money, that's fine, or you want to say we'll do it for free. But you can't say, we're going to do it for money here, and then all of a sudden, because we want to make a buck, but then all of a sudden you say we're going to invest all our money in Balak and Bilam. We can't do that. You can't. It just doesn't work. So he's saying that's exactly what he's saying is here is. He says they had a greedy. Like you said, rather we prove from there that they didn't really care about their money. Their whole intention, from the moment they saw Arab in Israel, their whole intention was to curse us, to cause us pain. And he says it wasn't about money. Because if it was about money, then they shouldn't have been so stingy about, they shouldn't have been so large when they were trying to hire Bilam. So he says, Ela Adrabah, Hayusonim et Yisrael. He says, it wasn't about money at all. It's about the hatred towards Aram Yisrael. And he says here, the fact that they did eventually give us food, right? That wasn't only for their own benefit, so that they can make some money, which would belong to them, meaning that I'm giving you food, but I'm making the money to cover my costs. Right? It wasn't like they're looking to make money. The whole point here is what he's saying is, therefore, the Moabim and the Ammonim were entire, but what doesn't answer a question I'm about to get to in a second. He says is that the whole, you can see from here that there was like you said, like a genocidal, like a very systematic approach to what their Ammon and Moab were all about. Ammon and Moab were about hating Am Yisrael. And no matter what they did, like, no matter how you look at it, he says every one of these ways, it all shows that they were very methodical, systematic about it. It doesn't answer the question is, if you say that that's the reason, their money, that they care about their money or that they hate us so much, then that doesn't answer the question as to why men are not allowed and women are allowed. Because then if you say that, they hate it so much, then women should not be allowed either. But that I don't have the answer to. Anyway, so now he says, well, Amara Katuv, now you go back to what did we say? Now, what's at the last psukim of this week's Parsha, it says, Amara Katuv, V'lo ava Hashem lishmo el bilam ve'yafoch lecha et haklala livracha. So he says, the pasuk says, that Hashem refused to listen to Bilam, and he reversed the curse to a blessing for you. He asked a very good question. He says, Mahu milat lecha. If you look at the words, the word lecha is completely extra. We don't need the word lecha to understand the pasuk. Vayafoch Hashem et haklala livracha. Right? What's the word lecha? So he says, Hare haklala lo ba leolam. Right? We know v'lo yatsa min hapeh v'lo yigel Yisrael v'im ke milat lecha miyuteret. He says what?
He didn't actually get to a klala.
Right, exactly. So he says the word lecha makes no sense. He's saying the klala never came to fruition.
Right.
Right, never came. Intention was there. Right. So that's the connection between the last part of the Torah that we just talked about, and this is exactly what he's saying. V'yesh lomar shekvar yadu Hashem mevarech et Yisrael yeh gam baruch v'hamekalel et Yisrael yeh aru. We already know in Breshit we know that mevarecha baruch mekalecha or we know that already, right? V'kamash v'lan krash afal pisha bilam berechet Yisrael im kol zalonit barech. We say that even though, what did Bilam do? We know that a person who blesses Bnei Israel gets the baruch himself, and a person who curses also gets cursed. So he says that the fact, even though Bilam did indeed give us a bracha, he didn't get the bracha.
Well, he was cursed.
Ala adraba, the fisha kavanato hayta lekalel, right? Uvaumot hakadosh baruch hu choshev v'machshava k'maaseh. He says, on the contrary, intention was to curse, and since his intention was to curse, Hashem doesn't. Not unlike us in Bnei Israel, which also an important lesson is that Hashem doesn't mitzaref machshava to maaseh. If we
machshava
tova, right? But in other words, if we have a machshava, right? If we have a machshava and we don't take action on it, right? We don't. For us, for Bnei Israel and the Jews, Hashem says, okay, you have a mind, you're thinking about something, you're thinking about doing a sin, but you don't actually do it. That's great. Meaning you don't actually take action on it. So I don't mitzaref. For a non-Jew, choshev machshava k'maaseh. According to the non-Jew, for the non-Jews, Hashem says, oh, your evil intentions are just as bad as the actions themselves. Therefore, he says he's staying.
That's the Gemara in Kedushin. Shabbos Tov is start from the Ma'aseh. For the Goyim, it's Machshava Ras and stuff.
Exactly. So it says that's why it says meaning Hashem says because Bilam has the whole intention was a klala. So what should have happened? It should have been his machshava was a klala. And his maaseh was to also be a klala. Right. But because Hashem didn't want to, that was only for Bilam. But for Bnei Israel, Hashem wanted to bless. So that's why it says, Vayafoch lecha, meaning for you, Bnei Israel, I switched it around. So the klala.
For him, it's still considered
exactly. For him, it's still klala. Because why? Because the entire intention was, his machshava was always ra, and therefore, just like we saw about Ammon and Moab, their entire intentions were bad, and therefore, similar to Ammon and Moab, Bilam came to try to curse us, and since the whole intention was curse, he got cursed himself. And unlike that,
Balak was up with that root. That's a great question.
That's a good question too. Yeah, but
by the way, Rabbi Biederman was at the Hilula. We missed it. Wow. The last part, 40 minutes. We're going to get the video. There's a shame. We're going to try and get hold of it.
I'm so
and upload it and.